3,000 years ago, in the humid tropical lowlands of Mesoamerica, the Olmec were doing something with cacao that would seem almost unrecognizable to us today. They fermented the seeds of the cacao fruit, dried them, roasted them, ground them into a dark paste, and mixed that paste with water and chili peppers. The result was bitter, intense, and often topped with a layer of foam. There was no sugar, no milk, no creamy filling, no chocolate bar. And this was not simply a sweet treat in an early form. Cacao belonged to a world of ritual, belief, status, and sacred meaning. To the ancient peoples who first developed these traditions, it could represent something far more important than flavor. Now jump forward roughly 3,000 years. Chocolate is everywhere. It sits in candy bars beside supermarket checkout lanes. It fills heart-shaped boxes every Valentine's Day. It appears as chocolate eggs and bunnies every Easter. It moves through enormous factories capable of producing millions of pieces for consumers around the world. And the global chocolate market is now worth more than $130 billion a year. That is an extraordinary transformation. How did a bitter ceremonial drink from the tropical forests of ancient Mesoamerica become one of the most desired foods on Earth? The answer is not simply that people discovered how to make chocolate taste better. Over the centuries, cacao would become valuable enough to function like money. Empires would seek control over the regions that produced it. European consumers would completely transform the way it was prepared. New machines would turn an expensive drink into a solid product that ordinary people could afford. And eventually, chocolate would become so deeply embedded in modern life that most of us rarely stop to think about where it came from. But there is another side to that success. Because the story of how chocolate became cheap, abundant, and globally available is also a story about conquest, industrial power, enormous supply chains, and the people who still bear much of the cost of producing it. To understand how all of that happened, we have to go back to a time when chocolate was not chocolate at all. Long before chocolate became something wrapped in foil or stacked beside a grocery store checkout lane, cacao belonged to an entirely different world. In the humid tropical regions of Mesoamerica, cacao trees grew beneath the shaded canopy of the rainforest. Their large pods contained seeds surrounded by a soft pulp, and those seeds required considerable preparation before they could become anything resembling a drink. The cacao seeds were fermented, then dried in the tropical heat. After that, they were roasted and ground into a thick, dark paste. Mixed with water, that paste produced an intensely bitter drink, unlike the chocolate most Americans would recognize today. There was no sugar, there was no milk, and there was no solid chocolate bar. For the Olmec, cacao was not simply an early version of a modern dessert. According to the historical framing of this story, it belonged to a much older cultural world, in which food, ritual, and belief were closely connected. Archaeological evidence from ancient vessels found in parts of present-day Honduras and Belize points to cacao use in the region more than 3,000 years ago. And as Olmec civilization declined, cacao did not disappear with it. Its importance continued into the Maya world, where cacao became even more deeply woven into everyday life, ceremony, and religious belief. Among the Maya, cacao could appear at some of the most important moments in a person's life. It was associated with birth ceremonies and marriages, with funerals and religious offerings, and with gatherings in which status and ritual mattered. Cacao also appears in Maya art and hieroglyphic writing, evidence that its significance extended far beyond the simple act of drinking it. And the drink itself was still very different from modern chocolate. Ground cacao could be mixed with water, cornmeal, chili peppers, and vanilla. Rather than trying to make the drink creamy or sweet, the Maya often focused on producing something else: foam. The liquid was poured back and forth between vessels, sometimes from a height, until a thick froth formed across the surface. That foam was not merely decorative, it was one of the most prized parts of the drink, and producing it properly became an important part of cacao preparation. For a modern consumer, chocolate is almost inseparable from sweetness. For the Maya, sweetness was not what made cacao valuable. Its importance came from the place it occupied in their society. Cacao could accompany people at birth, at marriage, in death, and in worship. It could appear in art, ceremony, and elite life. It carried social and symbolic meaning in ways that a modern candy bar simply does not. At this point in history, chocolate was not a snack. It was not candy. It was a cultural object. And soon, that cultural value would become something even more powerful. Cacao would become valuable enough to function like money. As cacao became more deeply embedded in Mesoamerican life, its value began to extend far beyond ceremony. The beans themselves became valuable enough to function as a form of currency. In markets across the region, cacao could be exchanged for goods, services, and even people. According to the accounts used in this story, around 100 cacao beans could buy a turkey, while an enslaved person might cost roughly 1,000. That meant cacao was no longer simply something people drank. It could be counted, stored, transported, traded, and exchanged for other forms of value. In a very literal sense, money grew on trees. By the time the Aztec Empire rose to power in central Mexico, cacao had become one of the most prized commodities in the region. But the Aztecs faced a major problem. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, stood in a high-altitude environment that was poorly suited to growing cacao. The trees needed warmer, wetter tropical conditions. The Aztecs wanted cacao. Their capital could not produce enough of it. That made the regions where cacao actually grew strategically important. And once demand became tied to political power, the solution was not simply trade. The Aztec Empire expanded its influence over cacao-producing territories and demanded cacao beans as tribute. Loads of beans began moving toward Tenochtitlan from conquered provinces. What had once been a culturally important drink was now part of an imperial economic system. The more territory the empire controlled, the more tribute it could extract. And the more cacao that flowed into the capital, the more strongly the bean became associated with wealth, status, and authority. Some estimates, cited in the original account, suggest that the Aztec Empire collected nearly 200 loads of cacao beans a year in tribute, with each load weighing roughly 50 pounds. At the center of this system stood the emperor. Montezuma II was reportedly an enthusiastic drinker of cacao, with later accounts claiming that he consumed as many as 50 cups a day, sometimes served in golden goblets. Whether every detail of those later stories can be taken literally or not, the symbolism is clear. Cacao had become a drink of power. It was associated with rulers and elites. Warriors consumed it. Priests used it in ceremonies. It appeared in sacred contexts and in traditions that connected cacao with divine origins, strength, wisdom, and vitality. The drink itself still looked nothing like modern chocolate. It was bitter, spiced, ceremonial. But its meaning had changed. Cacao was no longer only something that connected people to ritual and belief. It now connected them to wealth, to tribute, to conquest, and to the machinery of empire. That transformation would make cacao especially important when a new group of outsiders arrived on the coast of Mexico. Because when the Spanish encountered cacao, they were not simply discovering an unfamiliar drink. They were encountering a commodity that already sat at the intersection of religion, money, and political power. In 1519, Hernán Cortés arrived on the coast of Mexico with roughly 500 Spanish soldiers. When the Spaniards eventually entered the world of the Aztec court, they encountered cacao in a society where it already carried enormous economic, political, and ceremonial value. They were reportedly offered the bitter, heavily spiced cacao drink favored by the Aztecs. And by European standards, it was not especially appealing. There was no sugar to soften the bitterness, no milk to give it a creamy texture. The drink could be thick, intense, and flavored with ingredients completely unfamiliar to Spanish tastes. According to early accounts, some Spaniards reacted to it with open disgust, but taste was only part of what they were seeing. The Spaniards also encountered markets where cacao beans could function as currency, storerooms where tribute was collected, and an imperial system in which cacao represented wealth. They may not have immediately loved the drink, but they understood its value. Cortés and the men around him were entering an economy in which cacao could be accumulated, exchanged, taxed, and demanded as tribute. Whoever controlled the regions that produced cacao could control part of the wealth flowing through the Aztec Empire. That mattered far more than whether the first cup tasted good. 2 years later, in 1521, Tenochtitlan fell and the Aztec Empire collapsed under Spanish conquest. The political system that had gathered cacao as imperial tribute was transformed, but cacao itself did not disappear. Instead, it became part of the emerging Spanish colonial world. Beans continued to be produced in Mesoamerica, while knowledge of cacao began moving across the Atlantic toward Spain. And somewhere in that process, the drink began to change. The exact origins of the European-style chocolate recipe are difficult to pin down, but the account behind this story points to experimentation in Spanish colonial convents in places such as Guatemala and Mexico. New ingredients were introduced. Sugar was added to counter the natural bitterness of cacao. Cinnamon gave the drink a warmer, sweeter aroma. Vanilla added another layer of flavor. And instead of consuming cacao primarily in the older, bitter and spicy forms, Europeans increasingly prepared it as a hot, sweetened drink. Those changes may sound simple, but together they fundamentally altered chocolate's future. A drink shaped by the tastes and traditions of Mesoamerica was being adapted to the preferences of European consumers. The bitterness was softened. The heat from chili could be reduced or removed. Sweetness moved to the center of the experience, and chocolate began to acquire the flavor identity that modern consumers would eventually recognize. This transformation did something else as well. It made cacao attractive to a completely new audience. In Spain, sweetened chocolate began to move into aristocratic circles, where its exotic origin and expensive ingredients helped turn it into a luxury. What had once been consumed within Mesoamerican ritual, political, and economic systems was now becoming fashionable in European courts. Chocolate had crossed the Atlantic, but more importantly, it had crossed a cultural boundary. It was no longer simply a bitter ceremonial drink inherited from the civilizations of Mesoamerica. It had been reshaped for a new world of European wealth, fashion, and taste. And once Europe's elites developed a taste for it, keeping chocolate confined to Spain would become increasingly difficult. For a time, chocolate remained largely confined to Spain, where it became closely associated with wealth, privilege, and aristocratic life. Cacao still had to travel across the Atlantic from the Spanish colonial world, and preparing chocolate remained expensive and labor-intensive. That made it difficult for ordinary people to consume regularly. Among the wealthy, however, those same limitations made chocolate more desirable. It was exotic, it was imported, it was costly, and drinking it could signal that you belonged to a class of people wealthy enough to afford something most others could not. Chocolate gradually became part of aristocratic life in Spain, served in private homes and elite social settings as a fashionable luxury rather than an everyday drink. But exclusivity rarely survives once other elites discover what they are missing. By the early 17th century, chocolate had begun spreading beyond Spain into other parts of Europe, including Italy, France, and England. In France, it found an ideal home at court. Versailles was a world built around status, spectacle, fashion, and carefully displayed privilege. Chocolate fit naturally into that culture. Its foreign origin made it fashionable, while the cost of importing cacao and sugar helped preserve its association with wealth. Maria Theresa of Spain, who married Louis XIV of France, was reportedly especially fond of chocolate and drank it frequently. Stories about her enthusiasm helped reinforce chocolate's reputation as a courtly indulgence. Soon, drinking chocolate became fashionable among members of the French aristocracy. It was no longer simply something consumed for its flavor. The drink itself became part of the performance of elite life. The cups, the serving rituals, the expensive ingredients, and the company in which it was consumed all communicated status. Chocolate was becoming social currency. And in England, that social role would develop in a different direction. In 1657, one of London's earliest dedicated chocolate houses opened its doors. Chocolate houses became places where wealthy men could meet, talk, conduct business, exchange rumors, debate politics, and build social connections over cups of hot chocolate. They functioned almost like private clubs combined with cafes. The drink mattered, but so did the people sitting around the table. Samuel Pepys, the famous English diarist, wrote about drinking chocolate in London during the 1660s, providing a glimpse of how quickly the beverage had entered the social life of the city's upper classes. Different establishments began developing their own reputations and clientele. Political groups and influential men gathered at particular houses, turning some of them into informal centers of business and political discussion. One of the most famous examples was White's. Founded in 1693 as a chocolate house, White's eventually evolved into one of Britain's most exclusive gentlemen's clubs. That transformation captures what had happened to chocolate in Europe. It had arrived as an unfamiliar foreign drink. Then it became a luxury. Luxury became fashion, and fashion became a social institution. By the end of the 17th century, drinking chocolate could tell other people something about who you were, how much money you had, and which social circles you belonged to. But there was still one enormous limitation. For all its popularity among Europe's wealthy, chocolate remained expensive, difficult to produce, and largely beyond the reach of ordinary people. If chocolate was ever going to become something the entire world could consume, someone would have to change not just the recipe, but the way chocolate itself was made. For all its success among Europe's aristocracy, chocolate still had one major problem. It was expensive to make. Producing it required a long, labor-intensive process. Cacao beans had to be roasted, shelled, and ground by hand into a thick paste. The natural cocoa butter remained mixed with the cacao solids, giving the finished drink a heavy, greasy texture. And even after all that work, the result was far from smooth. Chocolate could be gritty, it could be oily, and it did not dissolve easily in water or milk. For wealthy Europeans, that was inconvenient but manageable. They had servants, specialized equipment, and enough money to treat chocolate as a luxury. For everyone else, it was another story. As long as chocolate remained difficult and expensive to process, it would stay largely in the hands of people who could afford the labor required to make it. That created the next great problem in chocolate's history. How do you take an expensive luxury drink, something associated with aristocrats, fashionable courts, and exclusive chocolate houses, and turn it into a product that millions of ordinary people can afford? The answer would not come from another emperor. It would not come from another conquistador. And it would not come from changing the flavor again. This time, chocolate would be transformed by technology. By the early 19th century, chocolate had already crossed oceans, entered royal courts, and become a symbol of wealth across Europe. But it was still fundamentally the same kind of product people had been drinking for centuries. That began to change in 1828. A Dutch chemist named Coenraad Johannes van Houten developed a hydraulic press that could squeeze much of the natural cocoa butter out of processed cacao. That single change solved several problems at once. Instead of being left with a thick, oily mass, manufacturers could separate chocolate into two basic components. One was cocoa butter, the natural fat contained inside cacao beans. The other was a compressed cake of cocoa solids. Once that cake was dried and pulverized, it could be turned into a fine cocoa powder. Compared with the heavy chocolate pastes that came before it, this powder was easier to handle, easier to mix into liquids, and far more practical for large-scale production. Van Houten also treated cocoa with alkaline salts, a process that reduced some of its natural acidity and bitterness and helped create a darker, smoother-tasting powder. The method became known as Dutch processing, or Dutching, and versions of it are still used in chocolate production today. The importance of the breakthrough went far beyond improving a cup of hot chocolate. Before the press, chocolate was expensive, oily, difficult to process, and difficult to make consistently. After it, manufacturers had something much more flexible. Cocoa could now be processed into a stable powder. Cocoa butter could be separated and used independently. And for the first time, the chocolate-making process had been broken into components that manufacturers could manipulate in entirely new ways. That opened the door to the next transformation. In 1847, the British company J.S. Fry & Sons discovered that cocoa powder could be combined with sugar and then mixed back together with melted cocoa butter. The result was no longer simply a drink. It became a thick, moldable chocolate mixture that could be shaped and allowed to harden. For thousands of years, cacao had primarily been prepared as something people drank. Now it could become something they could hold in their hands, something that could be broken into pieces, wrapped, stored, carried, and eaten without preparing a cup of chocolate first. That was a turning point. Chocolate had become a solid food, and once chocolate could be manufactured in solid form, an entirely new industry became possible. But the product still did not taste quite like the chocolate familiar to most Americans today. One major ingredient was still missing: milk. In the 19th century, combining milk with chocolate was technically difficult. Milk contains water, and water does not mix easily with the fats in chocolate. Even a relatively small amount of moisture could cause chocolate to seize, becoming thick, grainy, and difficult to work with. A Swiss chocolate maker named Daniel Peter spent years trying to solve the problem. The breakthrough came through his connection with Henri Nestlé, whose work with concentrated milk products offered a way around one of chocolate's biggest technical obstacles. By reducing much of the water before combining the milk with chocolate, Peter was eventually able to produce a stable milk chocolate. The result was sweeter, creamier, and milder than the darker chocolate products that had dominated the European market. Milk chocolate dramatically expanded what chocolate could taste like, and it moved the product another step closer to the smooth, sweet bars that would eventually dominate candy shelves in the United States and Europe. But one problem remained: texture. Even well-made chocolate could still feel coarse or grainy because the particles of cocoa and sugar had not been refined enough to create the silky texture modern consumers expect. Then, in 1879, Swiss chocolatier Rodolphe Lindt introduced the process that became known as conching. According to the account behind this story, Lindt discovered that allowing chocolate to remain in a mixing machine for an extended period dramatically changed its texture. Continuous mixing and refining reduced roughness, distributed the cocoa butter more evenly, and helped create a smoother, more fluid chocolate mass. The difference was enormous. Chocolate could now melt more evenly in the mouth. Its texture became softer and more luxurious. Harsh flavors could be reduced. The product became much closer to what modern consumers would immediately recognize as chocolate. Taken individually, each of these innovations solved a different problem. Van Houten made cacao easier to process. Fry helped turn it into a solid food. Peter and Nestlé made milk chocolate practical. Lindt transformed its texture. But together, they accomplished something much larger. In roughly half a century, chocolate had been completely redesigned. What had once been a gritty, oily, expensive drink associated largely with Europe's wealthy classes could now be manufactured as a smooth, sweet, solid product on an industrial scale. The technology was finally ready. But one final transformation still had to take place. Making modern chocolate was one thing. Making it cheap enough for millions of ordinary people to buy was another. And that would require a very different kind of innovator. By the late 19th century, the technology needed to make modern chocolate was finally in place. But chocolate was still not truly a mass-market food. It could be produced more efficiently than before, and manufacturers had learned how to make it smoother, sweeter, and solid. Yet high-quality chocolate remained closely associated with European makers and consumers who could afford it. Then Milton Snavely Hershey saw an opportunity. At the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Hershey encountered German chocolate-making machinery in operation. He had already built a successful caramel business, but what he saw convinced him that chocolate had much greater potential. Eventually, he sold his caramel company for $1 million, an enormous sum at the time, and committed himself to chocolate. The gamble was significant, but Hershey's greatest insight was not that he could make the finest chocolate in the world. European manufacturers, especially in Switzerland and Belgium, already had a reputation for exceptional quality. Hershey saw a different opportunity. He wanted to make chocolate affordable, not just for wealthy families, not just for people visiting luxury confectionery shops, but for ordinary Americans. That required more than a good recipe. It required scale. Hershey focused on industrial production, standardization, and a manufacturing system capable of turning huge quantities of ingredients into a consistent product at a price millions of consumers could afford. The goal was simple: make chocolate cheap enough that buying a bar no longer felt like a luxury. And Hershey did not stop at building a factory. In central Pennsylvania, an entire community grew around the chocolate business. The town became Hershey, Pennsylvania. The factory dominated the landscape, but the scale of Hershey's ambitions could also be seen in everything built around it. There was Chocolate Avenue. There was Cocoa Avenue. There were schools, parks, public facilities, and a trolley system. An amusement park was created for employees and local residents. The company was no longer simply producing candy. It was creating an entire industrial town around chocolate. That physical landscape showed just how dramatically the scale of the business had changed. A product that had once been prepared by hand for aristocrats was now being manufactured inside a system large enough to shape a town. The Hershey bar, introduced around the turn of the 20th century, became one of the defining products of that transformation. Chocolate could now be produced in huge quantities, wrapped individually, transported across long distances, and sold at prices ordinary consumers could manage. By the 1920s, Hershey was producing millions of bars, and competitors were moving quickly into the same expanding market. Frank Mars introduced the Milky Way in 1923, and companies across the United States were competing to develop new candy bars, new combinations, and new ways to make chocolate part of everyday life. The transformation was now complete in a way that would have been impossible only a few generations earlier. Chocolate had once announced privilege. Now it could sit in a child's pocket. It could be bought at a neighborhood store. It could be eaten on the way to work, carried on a train, or purchased almost without thinking about the cost. Chocolate had moved from luxury to habit, and once millions of people could afford it, the next question was no longer whether chocolate could become popular. It was how far that popularity could spread. The answer would come during one of the largest conflicts in human history, when chocolate was sent to war. By the time World War II began, chocolate had already become a familiar part of American life. But the war gave it an entirely new purpose. The U.S. military wanted a compact emergency ration that could deliver a large amount of energy, survive harsh conditions, and remain usable even when soldiers were operating far from normal supply lines. Hershey was asked to help create it. The military's requirements were unusually specific. The bar had to weigh about 4 ounces. It had to provide substantial calories. It had to resist melting in high temperatures. And, strangely enough, it was not supposed to taste too good. The reason was practical. This was emergency food. Military planners did not want soldiers eating their survival rations simply because they were hungry for candy. The bar needed to be edible, but not tempting enough to disappear before it was actually needed. The resulting product became known as the D-ration bar. It was dense, hard, heat-resistant, and intentionally far less enjoyable than an ordinary Hershey bar. The military reportedly wanted something that tasted only slightly better than a boiled potato. That sounds almost absurd for a company built around candy. But this was no longer chocolate designed primarily for pleasure. It had become military equipment, something small enough to fit into a soldier's pack, durable enough to survive transport, and energy-dense enough to matter when regular food was unavailable. And the scale of production was enormous. Over the course of the war, Hershey produced more than 3 billion military chocolate bars. 3 billion. At that point, chocolate was no longer moving through the world only as a commercial product. It was moving through military supply chains. Factories produced it by the millions. Trucks carried it to ports. Ships carried it across oceans. And soldiers carried it into Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. But chocolate did not remain inside military packs. As American troops entered towns and cities overseas, soldiers frequently shared pieces of chocolate with civilians and children. For many people living through wartime shortages, a small piece of American chocolate could be an extraordinary luxury. Those encounters gave chocolate another role. It became associated not just with calories or candy, but with American soldiers, wartime relief, and the sudden arrival of a product that many civilians had rarely, if ever, tasted before. When the war ended, those connections did not simply disappear. Millions of soldiers returned home, already accustomed to carrying and eating chocolate. Consumers abroad had become more familiar with American brands, and the enormous manufacturing systems built to supply wartime demand could now turn back towards civilian markets. In an unexpected way, the war had become one of the largest distribution networks chocolate had ever known. What began as an emergency military ration helped carry chocolate across continents, and after the fighting stopped, companies like Hershey, Mars, Cadbury, and Nestlé were ready to turn that global familiarity into something much bigger. Chocolate was about to become deeply embedded in modern popular culture. By the middle of the 20th century, chocolate had become something earlier generations could barely have imagined. It was no longer reserved for royal courts, wealthy households, or special chocolate houses. It had entered everyday life. In Britain, Cadbury had already helped push chocolate deeper into popular culture. The Cadbury family, who were Quakers, promoted chocolate partly as a wholesome alternative to alcohol. Around their factory near Birmingham, they developed Bournville, a model community with housing, parks, and recreational facilities for workers. Chocolate was no longer just shaping what people ate. It was shaping where people lived, how companies presented themselves, and how modern consumer culture developed around major brands. But the most interesting transformation was cultural. Thousands of years earlier, cacao had been tied to ritual in Mesoamerica. Now, chocolate was becoming part of a completely different set of rituals. On Valentine's Day, chocolate became a language of romance, packed into heart-shaped boxes and exchanged as a symbol of affection. At Easter, it appeared as chocolate eggs and rabbits, transforming a religious holiday into one of the year's major candy-selling seasons. And in the United States, Halloween became almost impossible to imagine without chocolate bars filling trick-or-treat bags across the country. Chocolate also became one of the easiest gifts to give. Birthdays, holidays, romantic occasions, celebrations, small gestures of thanks. The meaning was no longer sacred in the Maya sense, but the pattern was strangely familiar. Chocolate had once accompanied ceremonies that marked important moments in human life. Now, thousands of years later, it was doing something similar again. The gods had changed. The rituals had changed. The societies had changed. But chocolate was still being used to mark moments that people considered special. What began as a ceremonial drink had become a ritual of modern consumer life. And that enormous cultural success created demand on a scale the ancient cacao growers of Mesoamerica could never have imagined. The question now was no longer whether the world wanted chocolate. It was where all that cacao would come from and who would pay the price for producing it. By the 21st century, chocolate had become more successful than anything the ancient peoples of Mesoamerica could have imagined. According to the figures used in this story, the global chocolate market is worth more than $130 billion a year. Behind every candy bar, chocolate truffle, Easter egg, and heart-shaped Valentine's box is an enormous international network stretching from tropical farms to processing plants, factories, warehouses, supermarkets, and convenience stores around the world. But the farther you follow that supply chain back toward its beginning, the less glamorous the story becomes. A large share of the world's cacao is grown in West Africa. According to the figures cited in the original account, roughly 70% of global cacao production comes from the region, with Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana alone providing more than half of the world's supply. Much of that cacao is not grown on enormous industrial plantations. It comes from smallholder farmers working relatively small plots of land, often with limited financial security and little control over the final price consumers pay for chocolate. And that creates a fundamental imbalance. The companies selling finished chocolate operate in a global market worth tens of billions of dollars. But many of the people producing the raw ingredient at the beginning of that system remain poor. That economic pressure has also become connected to one of the industry's most disturbing problems: child labor. Investigations and reports cited in the original account have documented large numbers of children working under hazardous conditions on cacao farms in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. Some perform physically demanding work, some carry heavy loads, Some use machetes to clear vegetation or open cacao pods. Others may be exposed to agricultural chemicals and pesticides. These are not simply children helping with a few harmless chores around a family farm. The concern is hazardous labor work that can interfere with education, threaten children's health, and expose them to tools or conditions that should never be part of a child's working life. The problem has been known for decades. In 2001, major chocolate companies supported the Harkin-Engel Protocol, an effort intended to address the worst forms of child labor connected to cacao production. Yet more than 2 decades later, the problem has not disappeared. And that exposes one of the deepest contradictions in the modern history of chocolate. The Industrial Revolution made chocolate easier to manufacture. Mass production made it cheaper. Companies like Hershey, Mars, Cadbury, and Nestlé helped make it available to millions of ordinary consumers. That affordability created enormous demand. Enormous demand required an enormous supply of cacao, and pressure traveled backward through the supply chain toward the people growing it. The result is an uncomfortable irony. Chocolate is sold as pleasure, as celebration, as romance, as comfort, as a small reward at the end of an ordinary day. Yet the global system capable of delivering that pleasure so cheaply can depend on farming communities that receive only a small share of the value created from the crop they grow. The people closest to the cacao tree can be among those who benefit least from the finished chocolate bar. That does not erase the remarkable story of how chocolate became a global product, but it changes what that success means. Because the history of chocolate is not only a story about making something cheaper and more accessible, it is also a story about what can happen when billions of consumers want the same product and the economic pressure required to keep supplying it at a price they are willing to pay. After the darker realities of the global cacao trade, there is another side of modern chocolate that has begun to change the way people think about what they are eating. Over the past several years, a growing bean-to-bar movement has focused on treating cacao less like a standardized industrial ingredient and more like an agricultural product with its own origin, character, and flavor. Some small chocolate makers now work more directly with cacao farmers, buying beans from specific farms, cooperatives, or regions, rather than blending cacao from many different sources into one uniform product. That has helped popularize the idea of single-origin chocolate. And once cacao is treated this way, something becomes clear. Chocolate is not one flavor. It can be hundreds of flavors. The taste of a chocolate bar can begin with the genetics of the cacao tree itself. Different varieties can produce different characteristics, but genetics are only the beginning. The soil matters. The climate matters. The amount of rainfall matters. The surrounding vegetation can matter. And once the cacao pods are harvested, the flavor continues to change. Fermentation plays a major role. How long the beans are fermented, how they are turned, how much heat develops inside the fermenting mass, and how carefully that process is controlled can all influence the final result. Then, the beans are dried. Later, they are roasted. A lighter roast may preserve more delicate or fruity notes. A heavier roast can produce deeper, darker, more familiar chocolate flavors. After that comes grinding, refining, and conching, each step shaping texture and aroma in different ways. By the time a finished bar reaches the consumer, its flavor is the result of an entire chain of biological and human decisions. That is why cacao from different parts of the world can taste dramatically different. Beans grown in Madagascar may produce bright, acidic, fruit-forward notes. Cacao from Ecuador may offer a completely different profile. Beans from Vietnam can develop yet another combination of fruit, spice, bitterness, and roasted character. In this sense, cacao begins to look less like a generic candy ingredient and more like coffee, wine, or other agricultural products shaped by place. That idea is captured in the word terroir, the combination of environment, growing conditions, and local practices that influence how an agricultural product tastes. For more than a century, large chocolate manufacturers have worked hard to create consistency. A familiar candy bar is supposed to taste almost exactly the same whether you buy it in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, or anywhere else in the country. To achieve that consistency, Manufacturers can blend cacao from different sources and use roasting and processing techniques designed to produce a stable, recognizable flavor. There is nothing accidental about that uniformity. It is one of the achievements of industrial chocolate. But bean-to-bar makers are showing consumers another possibility. Instead of asking how to make every bar taste the same, they ask what makes one harvest, one farm, or one region taste different from another. That changes the way chocolate can be understood. It is no longer simply a sweet, brown product manufactured in a factory. It begins with a tree, a climate, a farm, a fermentation, a roast, and a particular place on the planet. Chocolate is not one flavor. It is an agricultural product capable of expressing hundreds of them. For all of chocolate's success, its future is not guaranteed. Cacao trees are unusually sensitive to their environment. They need consistently warm temperatures, high humidity, abundant rainfall, and protection from harsh direct sunlight. They also grow best within a relatively narrow tropical belt around the equator. That makes cacao vulnerable when those conditions begin to shift. Rising temperatures and changing rainfall patterns can place trees under stress, reduce yields, and make cacao growing regions more vulnerable to disease. And disease is already a serious problem. Fungal infections such as black pod disease can damage cacao pods before they are harvested, while other plant diseases can weaken entire farms and reduce production over time. If warmer conditions make those threats more difficult to control, some of today's most important cacao growing regions could become harder to farm. Researchers and producers are already looking for ways to respond. One approach is breeding cacao varieties that can tolerate heat, disease, and changing environmental conditions more effectively. Another is expanding production into new regions where future climates may remain suitable for cacao. Parts of South and Southeast Asia are being explored as potential areas for additional cultivation, while controlled growing environments may eventually play a larger role as well. And there is an even more radical possibility. Some companies are experimenting with ways to reproduce chocolate-like flavors without relying entirely on traditional cacao beans, using fermentation and other food technologies to create similar flavor compounds from different plant materials. Whether consumers will accept those alternatives on a large scale remains uncertain, but the question facing chocolate is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. For thousands of years, humans have changed cacao to fit their tastes, their economies, and their technologies. Now the environment may force cacao to change in return, and if the climate changes faster than the cacao tree can adapt, the chocolate of the future may look very different from the chocolate we know today. Think about what cacao has been over the course of this story. It began as part of ritual life. It became a sacred object tied to belief and ceremony. Then it became currency, imperial tribute, a marker of status, a luxury consumed by Europe's elite. At different moments, it was treated as medicine, transformed by industrial technology, carried as a military ration, exchanged as a holiday gift, and eventually absorbed into a global commodity system worth tens of billions of dollars. Few foods have changed meaning so many times, and that is what makes the history of chocolate larger than the history of something sweet. It is a story about what happens when human desire creates value. Once something becomes valuable, people begin competing to control it. Control produces wealth. Wealth creates power. Power builds trade networks, industries, technologies, and institutions designed to produce more of the thing people want. And once industrial production makes that product cheap enough for millions of people to consume, desire itself begins operating at a global scale. Chocolate followed that entire path. A substance once prepared for ritual became something empires could collect as tribute. A drink reserved for elites became a product factories could manufacture by the millions. A luxury became an everyday habit. And an everyday habit became a global system connecting cacao farmers in tropical regions with factories, corporations, supermarkets, and consumers thousands of miles away. That system created extraordinary abundance, but it also created pressure, inequality, and new forms of dependence. So the history of chocolate is not simply the story of how humans learned to make cacao sweeter. It is the story of how desire can become value, how value can become power, how power can become industry, and how industry can eventually connect the lives of people across the entire world through something as small as a piece of chocolate. 3,000 years ago, cacao was being poured between vessels in the tropical world of Mesoamerica, transformed into a bitter, foamy drink with ritual meaning. Today, you can hold the end result in one hand. A modern chocolate bar may take only a few seconds to unwrap and eat, but the journey that placed it there took thousands of years. It passed through sacred ceremonies and imperial tribute, European courts and industrial inventions, factory towns and battlefields, global trade networks, and the labor of millions of people who helped turn cacao into one of the most familiar foods on Earth. The object became ordinary. Its history never was. So the next time you break off a piece of chocolate, remember that you are holding far more than candy. You are holding the final form of a story that began in a tropical forest thousands of years ago and is still changing today. And if the hidden histories inside ordinary things make you curious, chocolate is only one of them.